Oh, the box was small, elegant, wrapped in silver paper with a bow too perfect to be spontaneous. I opened it slowly, trying to hide how hard my hands were shaking. Inside was a gold bracelet. Thin, dainty, too dainty, not my taste, not my size. My husband smiled, pleased with himself. I thought it was delicate, like you. But it wasn't for me. Not really. The receipt said it all, tucked beneath the velvet lining, almost like a warning I wasn't meant to find. Item: custom ring, exchanged. Client T. Bennett. Date 3 days ago. I stared at the bracelet while he sipped his wine, already checking his phone. Happy anniversary, Grace. The rooftop lights blurred into soft hellos behind him. Portland's skyline looked beautiful that night. Too beautiful for what was unraveling beneath it. I wasn't shocked. Not really, just tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of trying. Tired of shrinking myself into someone easier to love. He excused himself for a client call. He always does. 15 minutes later, the server returned with the check. Already paid. I glanced at the slip, table reserved for S. Lawson. The name sat there like an open wound. Not hidden. Not subtle. Just careless. The kind of carelessness that comes when someone thinks you're too slow, too loyal, too used to being last. I didn't say anything. Not that night. Not in the car ride home. But something inside me moved. Just slightly. Like a hairline crack on glass. You don't hear it right away. But it's the beginning of the shatter. I stood in our walk-in closet that night, still in the navy sheath dress I bought just for him. He was already asleep. Of course he was. I found the receipt again, read every word. He hadn't bought me a gift. He had traded one lie for another, and that was the moment I knew. He didn't just forget who I was. He replaced me. So I made a decision. By Thursday, he'd understand what that meant. Would you confront him right away, or gather proof first? Where are you listening from tonight? Ever felt something break quietly inside you? The next morning, I folded the navy dress and tucked it back into its garment bag. I didn't hang it with the others. I placed it flat, zipped it up, and slid it to the back of the closet. Out of sight. Out of reach. The kitchen was quiet. Just the hum of the fridge and the soft tick of the wall clock. Thomas had already left. His coffee cup rinsed, not washed. A butter knife on the counter, still sticky with jam. I stared at it longer than I should have. For 17 years, I'd packed his lunch when he was in a rush, ironed his shirts when the cleaners messed up the starch. I kept birthdays on a spreadsheet, knew his client roster better than he did. And somehow, in all of that, I stopped recognizing the woman who once dreamed of writing novels. Now I reviewed contracts all day, then reviewed dinner options all night. We weren't a couple anymore. We were a system, efficient, predictable, functional, until I looked closer. There was a dinner 2 weeks ago. Thomas had come home late, distracted, smelling faintly of something floral. Not my perfume, not his cologne. Something lighter, sweeter. I remember asking, long day. And he replied, client meeting ran late. You know how Jim talks. Jim doesn't wear gardenia. Still, I let it go. Like I always do. That Saturday I found a charge on our joint card for a hotel in Salem. He said it was a conference. But I'd checked the calendar. No events scheduled there that week. I wanted to ask again, but I hated the sound of my voice when I questioned him. Small. Insecure, like I was fishing. So I stayed quiet. I went about the motions. Our Tuesday dinner with the Marcuses, church on Sundays, grocery lists scribbled on the fridge in my handwriting. His life didn't skip a beat. But I did. One afternoon at work, I caught myself deleting old photos from my phone. Not by accident, just erasing. Anniversaries. Beach trips. The blurry one from our 10th year when I thought he looked at me like I mattered. Each photo disappeared with a swipe. Clean. Final. I didn't tell anyone. Not Chloe, not Rachel, not my sister in Vermont. I told myself I was protecting my marriage. But really, I was protecting the illusion that I still had one. The thing is, when you're slowly replaced, it doesn't feel like a thunderclap. It's a drift. A missed kiss on the cheek. Ah, love you. That drops the I. A gift that doesn't fit. And slowly, your reflection changes. You don't notice it until someone else looks at you and doesn't see anything at all. That weekend, I went into his home office while he was out. I wasn't snooping, just observing. There were new folders on the desk, client proposals I hadn't seen before, a handwritten note tucked under his laptop. I unfolded it. Can't wait for Maui, room 6017. You picked the wine this time. XOS. The penmanship was neat, the ink a soft blue, the paper thick like hotel stationery. My breath caught. I put it back exactly where I found it. I walked out of the office and boiled water for tea. Chamomile, my usual. Then I sat by the window, watching the wind move through the trees. Not crying. Not even shaking. Just breathing through a betrayal I hadn't fully admitted to yet. Thomas came home a few hours later whistling. He kissed my temple, asked what was for dinner. I told him chicken piccata. He said, great, and didn't ask how my day was. He never does anymore. That night, as I loaded the dishwasher, my phone buzzed. A message from Chloe. Thinking of you today. Miss our coffee dates. Let's talk soon. I almost cried. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the microwave door. The kitchen light above me flickered softly. I looked tired. Like someone who knew something she couldn't say out loud yet. The worst part of betrayal is when it pretends to be normal. The bracelet sat untouched on my nightstand. Its thin chain curled like a lie that couldn't quite untangle itself. I hadn't worn it. Wouldn't. Every morning, it stared back at me as I made the bed, fluffed his pillow, smoothed the quilt. That bed had once been a haven. Now it felt staged. 3 days after our anniversary, I found his laptop open on the kitchen island. Unlocked. Careless. He was in the shower. I told myself I wouldn't snoop. But my hand moved anyway. The cursor hovered over his browser. One tab open. Villa packages Maui. Adults only. Another. Ring resizing. Custom bands. My chest tightened. I clicked nothing. Just stared. There was no flight confirmation. No hotel receipt. But I knew. And what hurt more? He wasn't hiding it because he feared hurting me. He was hiding it because I didn't matter enough to consider. At work, I couldn't focus. My emails piled up. A contract revision sat open on my screen for 38 minutes. I read the same paragraph 4 times. My co-worker Sheila leaned over. You okay, Grace? You look a little pale. I nodded. Didn't sleep well. Not a lie. Just not the whole truth. That afternoon I called Rachel. I didn't say much, just asked if she was free for lunch sometime soon. Her voice lit up. Absolutely? You picked the day. I said I'd text her. Then I didn't, because I wasn't ready to say it out loud. That night, Thomas came home humming. He poured himself a drink, rye whiskey, 2 ice cubes. Same glass he always used, with the tiny chip near the rim. We sat in the living room. He scrolled through his phone. I folded laundry. I held one of his shirts up to the light. There was a faint lipstick mark near the collar. Not red. Something rosier. I stared at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly anyway. He glanced up. Everything okay? I smiled. A's okay as always. He nodded, satisfied. Didn't look twice. That weekend, I checked our shared account. There was a $2,500 debit from a place called Kilani Experiences. I looked it up. Luxury couple excursions, sunset cruises, private chefs, massage for 2 packages. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the transaction. My tea went cold beside me. Then I created a spreadsheet. I labeled it Timeline Anomalies. I entered dates, amounts, descriptions. I added a second tab, Receipts. A third, Communications. It was the most organized I'd felt in months. Not angry. Not even heartbroken. Just methodical. He was planning a future. He just hadn't included me in it. The next morning, I opened the hall closet. His duffel bag was gone. The expensive one I bought him 2 Christmases ago. I hadn't seen it in weeks. I opened the drawer in our bathroom. Half of his toiletries were missing. His travel cologne. The electric toothbrush. I walked back to the bedroom. The silence buzzed. He wasn't leaving. He'd already left. He was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. That night, we had dinner with friends, Mark and Elaine. At some overpriced steakhouse he insisted on. Elaine asked about our anniversary. I opened my mouth to speak, but Thomas cut in. It was lovely. Grace picked the place. Perfect view. Elaine smiled. How sweet! You two always seem so solid. I felt my fork press harder against the tablecloth. Thomas reached for my hand. I let him. His fingers felt colder than the air-conditioned dining room. When dessert came, he ordered crème brûlée for two. I hate crème brûlée. He knows that. I smiled politely. Because it was easier than correcting him in front of company. Because being solid was a performance I had memorized. When we got home, he went straight to bed. Didn't say goodnight. I stayed in the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, stared at the dishwasher's blinking light. I used to cry after moments like these. Now I cataloged them. And every day, I gathered just a little more proof that the man I married had rewritten the ending without telling me. It started with a box of mail, just ordinary envelopes and catalogs, but wedged between them was a postcard. No stamp, no message, just an image. 2 champagne flutes, sunset in the background. Maui. I flipped it over. Blank. I knew the handwriting even before I saw it, gracefully slanted. A looping S at the corner. Sophie Lawson. He must have brought it back from work, or maybe she dropped it off. Either way, it was meant to be seen. A breadcrumb. A quiet declaration. That afternoon, I opened his bottom desk drawer while he was outside trimming the hedges. I never opened that drawer. It was his space. Inside were 2 passports. Ours. And a small leather pouch. I unzipped it. Receipts. Dinner for 2 at Le Jardin, $420. Spa treatments at the Pearl Ridge Resort. A jewelry boutique called Dilia & Sons. My throat tightened. One receipt was for a platinum ring with a Marquise cut sapphire. Not my style, not my size, not my name on the engraving. To us, forever. I stood up too fast. Nearly knocked over the chair. Outside I could hear the hedge trimmer. Steady, loud, mechanical. He had no idea I was inside, holding the proof. He had no idea I had finally stopped lying to myself. When he came in, I had already placed everything back. Flawless. Undisturbed. He kissed my cheek, his lips cold. Thinking Thai tonight? He asked. I nodded. Sure. Your favorite? We ate in silence, the sound of the television filling the space between bites. That night, I went into the guest room. Closed the door. Locked it. He didn't ask why, didn't even comment, like he knew. Or didn't care. The next day I called Rachel. This time, I didn't ask for lunch. I said, I need to talk. Privately. Her voice changed. Instantly. Grace, I'm listening. I think he's planning something. Financial. Legal. I found things. She didn't hesitate. Come in tomorrow. Bring everything you have. I ended the call and stared at my phone for a long time. There were no messages from Thomas. Not even a text. We had dinner again that night. Another routine meal. I asked him how work was. He said, busy. Then he looked up at me, eyes steady. We should take a break. I blinked. A break. He nodded like he'd rehearsed it. We've been disconnected. You're distant. I think some space could help. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I set it down slowly, took a sip of water to cover the shaking. What kind of space? He shrugged. A couple weeks. Maybe longer. I've booked something in Maui. Just to reset. I swallowed. So you're going alone. His pause was just long enough. Then, yeah, alone. He didn't look at me, didn't apologize. I see. I stood, carried my plate to the sink. Didn't drop it. Didn't cry. He followed me in, leaning against the doorway like nothing had shifted. Grace, this isn't about you. I just need to figure things out. Of course? I said. I hope Maui helps. He smiled. Relieved, like I'd given him permission. And maybe I had. But what he didn't know was this. The version of me that smiled that night was already gone. The real me was at Rachel's office at 10:00 a.m. the next morning with a folder labeled, for review. Inside screenshots, receipts, bank activity, and a copy of the ring receipt. Rachel took one look and nodded. This is enough to start. Start what? I wasn't entirely sure. But something had begun. And he'd never see it coming. Rachel's office smelled like eucalyptus and printer ink. The walls were soft gray, the kind of color that tried to be neutral but always felt like a quiet warning. Everything about the space was calm, except me. I sat on the edge of the guest chair, folder in my lap, hands folded too tightly. Rachel scanned the pages in silence, flipping them slowly. Every click of paper made my heart thud louder. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were steady, sharp behind her reading glasses. "Grace," she said gently, "this isn't an affair. This is a financial exit plan." I nodded, but something inside me still wanted to scream, not because I didn't believe her, but because hearing it out loud made it real. Permanent. I stared down at the copy of the receipt again. The custom ring. The message, "To S. Forever. T." And still, I kept asking myself the same useless question. Why didn't he just tell me? I already knew the answer. Because he didn't want honesty. He wanted an advantage. A head start. Rachel's voice broke through. "Have you seen a lawyer before this?" I shook my head. "No, you're the first." She nodded slowly. "We'll start with documentation. Next, we protect your access, financially and legally." Words like emergency injunction, account freeze, spousal protection. They landed like puzzle pieces on a table I'd never known I needed. "I'll walk you through every step," she said. "You're not alone in this." But when I walked out of her office that afternoon, I felt more alone than ever. Not because I didn't trust her, because I had trusted him. And now, that trust was gone, dissolved not in anger, but in quiet devastation. At home, the silence greeted me like a blanket I didn't ask for. The walls felt tighter. The air heavier. Even the light through the windows looked unfamiliar. I went to our bedroom. Opened his side of the closet. 3 shirts missing. The monogrammed cufflinks box gone. The leather duffel bag I hadn't seen in months. Now back, unzipped and half full. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. For 17 years, I'd washed his clothes, packed for his trips, reminded him to bring sunscreen. And now he was packing to disappear. Without me. I found the postcard on his dresser. Same worn Maui sunset, champagne glasses. Only now, Sophie had added a note. "See you soon, S?" No envelope. No attempt to hide it. He was no longer pretending. I went into the bathroom. Stared at myself under the bright vanity lights. The woman in the mirror looked older than I remembered. The lines around my mouth deeper. My eyes duller. A small scar above my right brow, the one from slipping on ice 3 winters ago, looked more visible somehow. I touched my face, just to feel something familiar. But nothing about her felt like me anymore. I stood there until the light started to flicker. Then I turned it off and left the room in the dark. The next morning, Thomas was already gone. His side of the bed was cold. His coffee cup rinsed, not washed. A dish towel slung over the faucet like a flag of retreat. I opened the bank app. A new charge, 6,400. Filed under Kailani Holdings, luxury travel. He was moving money, and he didn't think I'd notice. Or maybe he didn't care if I did. By noon, I had printed every bank statement from the last 4 months. I sat at the dining table, surrounded by paper, highlighter in hand. Line by line, I built my timeline. Expenses, patterns, dates, Rachel had told me. Every dollar tells a story. She was right. Later that day, I sat in the guest room with the door shut. I stared at my phone for a full 5 minutes before pressing call. "Hi, Mom," Chloe answered. Her voice was soft, but cautious. She knew something was wrong. She always did. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound even. Pause. "What's going on?" And then, it happened. I cried. For the first time since this all began, I let the tears fall. Not loud. Not messy. Just honest. Chloe didn't say anything at first. She let me breathe. Let me break. And when I finally spoke, it came out in fragments. "He's leaving. Planning it for months. There's someone else. I think I disappeared a long time ago." She listened. Then she said quietly, "You didn't disappear. You were erased. And now you get to rewrite yourself." That moment broke something in me. But it also let something else in. Strength. Clarity. A thread of belief I could hold on to. That night, I sat outside in the yard barefoot, wine glass in hand. The grass was cool beneath me. The sky above was blanketed in cloud, not a star in sight. But I knew they were there, hidden, like hope. Somewhere behind the heaviness, something steady still existed. And so did I, just barely, but enough. The folder on my nightstand grew heavier by the day. Not from paper, but from what the paper meant. It was no longer just a file, it was a reckoning. A quiet collection of receipts, transfers, emails, and omissions. A portrait of a marriage painted in transactions. Every night, I sat with it, highlighter in hand, reading by the glow of a single lamp. The one he used to complain was too yellow. The pages told the story he never said out loud. Dinner dates I didn't attend. Airfare I didn't book. Rooms I didn't sleep in. Gifts I didn't receive. There were lines of spending in places I'd never been. Spas, jewelers, beachside resorts. But what struck me wasn't the extravagance. It was the routine. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system. He had planned his disappearance like a seasoned strategist. And I'd been moving through the days like it was all still salvageable. One morning, I watched him load his car from the kitchen window. Steam curled from my coffee mug. Outside, he was humming. He placed 2 suitcases in the trunk. One was the black roller I'd packed for years. The other, sleek navy with a gold zipper, I'd never seen. New luggage, new life. He came in briefly to grab his keys. Back Thursday, he said, not looking up. Water the orchids. I nodded. He kissed the top of my head like a colleague. The door closed behind him. Just a soft click. But it sounded like a verdict. I stood there for a while, holding my coffee, staring at the door. Then I walked into our bedroom, straight to the closet. The safe sat on the top shelf. Same code he never thought I remembered. I did. Inside deeds, old tax forms, insurance policies, and one envelope, sealed, marked, trust, revised. I opened it with shaking fingers. A new draft of our family trust, his name, my name, and, beneath us both, Sophie Lawson, listed as secondary beneficiary. Not discussed, not mentioned, just inserted. I felt my legs wobble. I sat down on the floor of the closet, envelope in hand, breathing shallow and fast. He had written her into the life we built. Onto the paper I once helped him draft. I didn't cry. There weren't tears left for this version of betrayal. It was too sharp for that. It was clean. Surgical. Like he'd removed me with a scalpel. That night I called Rachel. "We need to move," I said. "He's shifting things faster than I thought." Her tone shifted instantly. "Come in tomorrow. Bring everything. I'll file the asset freeze." We met the next day in her downtown office. She looked at me like I wasn't fragile. She looked at me like I was a client with power. She said things like, exclusive use, temporary restraining order for financial protection, and discovery request for hidden accounts. And I followed every word, because I knew this language. I just never imagined applying it to my own life. By the time I left, I had a folder of my own. This one labeled, Grace Bennett, protective petition filed. I held it against my chest all the way to the car. It felt solid. It felt like something no one could take. At work, I kept quiet. But everything inside me was louder than ever. The clack of my keyboard sounded like thunder. The hum of the office fridge made me flinch. Even the ticking of my desk clock grated. At lunch, Sheila dropped off a glazed donut on my desk. She smiled. "Friday calories don't count." I smiled back. But I couldn't taste sweet anymore. Nothing tasted like it used to. That night, I went home, reheated soup I didn't want, and sat at the kitchen table alone. The house was too quiet. But I didn't turn on music. Didn't call anyone. I needed the quiet. After dinner, I lit a candle in the living room. Sandalwood, the one Thomas always said gave him a headache. I let it burn. I sat cross-legged on the couch in old college sweatpants, holding the warmth of the mug in both hands. Not coffee. Just peppermint tea. Because it didn't need to please anyone else. I looked around the room. Really looked. The throw pillows I picked. The lamp I loved. The bookshelf he said was cluttered. It wasn't clutter. It was mine. For the first time, I noticed how much of the house still had my imprint, and how much I'd shrunk to make room for his comfort. I went to the guest room, opened the bottom drawer, and found my old journal. Leather, bound, edges soft with age. A gift from Chloe years ago. I opened to a blank page and started writing. Not dates, not numbers, not evidence, feelings. I wrote about the day I realized he hadn't looked at me in months. About the first night I felt relieved when he didn't come home. About the shame of pretending everything was fine because I didn't want to be pitied. I wrote until my fingers cramped. Until my back ached. Until I could breathe again. When I finished, I signed the page like a letter. To the woman I used to be. Thank you for surviving this long. Before bed, I folded a sweater I knew he hated. Too bulky, he once said. I laid it out to wear tomorrow. Because I was done molding myself into his preferences, done minimizing my space, done rehearsing quiet forgiveness. Now, I was building something else, quiet, firm, unapologetic. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small in my own home. I felt rooted. I turned off the light and let the candle burn a little longer. Would you gather proof in secret, or confront it all at once? Have you ever had to reclaim space that once felt like it wasn't yours? Share your story below. Someone out there might need to read it. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of justice, healing, and empowerment after 40. Monday morning arrived with a sense of urgency I hadn't felt in years. Not panic, not dread, but motion. Rachel had scheduled a forensic accountant, someone she trusted. The best in the state, she said. I packed the folder, the flash drive, and the printed timeline. I wore a navy suit I hadn't touched since a deposition 3 years ago. I added earrings he once said looked too serious. Perfect. The accountant's office was minimalist, with dark wood and brushed metal. He didn't blink at the stack of paper I handed him. Just nodded, clicked his pen, and began to review. After 20 minutes, he spoke. There are offshore accounts here, small ones, but consistent. You've been left out for a while. I didn't flinch. I expected it. But hearing it aloud still landed like a weight on my chest. How long? I asked. He tapped the paper. Based on these patterns, 2 years, maybe longer. 2 years. Of lies. Of sitting across from me at dinner, smiling. Of watching me refill his prescriptions, pay the tax bill, fold his socks. I gripped the edge of the chair. Not because I was shocked, but because rage needs something to hold on to. Rachel leaned over. This strengthens your case. It's dissipation of marital assets. Judges hate that. I nodded. I didn't need revenge. I needed results. We filed a motion for immediate discovery. Rachel moved fast. She didn't wait for permission. Just results. Do not move out of the house, she reminded me. Don't sign anything. Don't meet him anywhere. All communication goes through me now. I went home and took pictures of every drawer, every closet, every box of documents. I took inventory. The silver cufflinks from our 10th anniversary. Gone the watch he said he sold to cover an unexpected tax bill. Found it. In the back of his sock drawer. The next day, I called the travel agency number I'd seen on one of the receipts. Used a calm voice. Hi, this is Grace Bennett. My husband booked a trip recently. I just need a copy of the itinerary for our records. There was a pause. Let me pull that up. Oh! The trip under Thomas Bennett and Sophie Lawson. Right. My hand tightened around the phone. Yes, that's the one. She rattled off the dates. The hotel. The suite number. A couple's spa reservation. Sunset dinner for 2. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence. It was no longer theory. No longer speculation. It was happening. And I wasn't invited. I printed everything. Added it to the binder. Section labeled. Direct confirmation. That night, I stood in the hallway, staring at our wedding photo. It had dust on the frame. A photo we never updated. His eyes looked younger. Mine looked hopeful. I took it down. Placed it in the bottom drawer of the hallway console. Not broken. Just put away. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen with new eyes. Everything looked different. Sharper. Less sentimental. The dishes we chose on our registry. The coffee maker I researched for weeks. The wall calendar still filled with reminders in my handwriting. I began to erase. Doctor appointment G deleted. Anniversary trip planning E erased. Dinner with Sophie's parents. Masked as client dinner. A highlighted. Everything he touched I re-labeled. Reclaimed. By Friday, Rachel called. We're moving forward. We have enough to petition for full discovery, asset freeze, and emergency relief. But I have to ask. Are you ready to make it official? I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window. The garden needed weeding. The mailbox flag was up. The neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Then I said, yes. I'm done waiting for someone to choose me. Rachel's voice softened. Then let's begin. We set a court date, filed emergency relief paperwork, and prepared to serve Thomas on his return. I wasn't scared. I was ready. On Saturday, I walked through the house alone, room by room, just breathing it all in. This had been my home. It still was. But I had let it shrink around his comfort. No more. I opened every window. Let the air move. I rearranged the furniture slightly. Hung a framed quote in the hallway. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. I lit sandalwood again. Opened a bottle of wine. Sat on the back deck and wrote a list. What I am reclaiming: my time, my name, my home, my version of the truth. My future Thomas would be home in 2 days. And he wouldn't find the same woman waiting. He walked through the door like nothing had changed. Dropped his leather weekender on the rug, stretched his arms wide like a man returning from a corporate retreat, not a betrayal. There was a slight sunburn around his collar. I noticed it. Not because I cared, but because it confirmed everything I already knew. He smiled. That same effortless smirk he used with clients and baristas. Miss me? He said. I didn't answer, just stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, the binder already on the dining table. His eyes followed mine, landed on it, paused. He walked over, slowly. Opened it. What is this? His voice was still playful, light, but the undertone had changed. Documentation, I replied. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every receipt with Sophie's name on it. He gave a short laugh, then closed the binder. Jesus, Grace. You've really been busy. No busier than you. He didn't expect that. I saw it in the tightening around his mouth. He sat down, opened the binder again, flipped through. You've been collecting all this? For months? Silence. Then, this is why you've been so off. I raised an eyebrow. Off, he sighed. Look, if you were upset, you could have talked to me. We could have figured this out. You mean like how you figured out how to open 2 offshore accounts under the name TB Holdings? I slid the bank screenshots across the table. Labeled, highlighted, dated. He didn't even pretend to be shocked. Didn't deny. Just leaned back. I needed flexibility, he said calmly. The business was shifting. I stared at him. You were shifting. Out of our marriage. I didn't think you'd understand. You mean you hoped I wouldn't notice? He looked at me then, really looked. And for a moment, I saw it. The crack. The first flicker of fear. This can get ugly, Grace. You don't want that. I leaned in slightly. I'm not afraid of ugly. I've lived through quiet erasure for years. You think I'll fold now? His face changed. Hard. You think you're going to win something? This house? Money. That's not who you are. I smiled just a little. Not who you thought I was. He stood suddenly, pacing. This is over the top. Chloe won't understand this. She'll blame you. Chloe already knows. And she told me to stand up. He froze. The moment her name came into it, his script wavered. I could almost see him recalculating. Adjusting. I made mistakes, okay? He said, hands raised slightly. But we can fix this. Quietly. No lawyers. I walked to the counter. Picked up the second binder. Label it Emergency Relief Filing, Bennett v. Bennett. I placed it on top of the first. Why have a court date in 4 days? He didn't speak, just stared at the stack. He finally sat down again, slowly. You were always smarter than you let on. I wasn't hiding it. I was giving you the benefit of the doubt. You mistook that for weakness. He stood again, slower this time, picked up his bag. Where are you going? I asked. Hotel. His voice clipped. I need time to think. I nodded. You've had 2 years. He left without another word. This time, the door didn't slam. It just clicked shut. 4 days later, we stood in court. Rachel was beside me in navy, her binder double, thick. Her eyes didn't leave the judge once. Thomas was 2 rows down with his attorney. A man I didn't recognize, young, polished, not ready. The courtroom was cool, almost cold, fluorescent lights humming softly. Wood panels polished to a muted shine, a small flag behind the judge's bench, unmoving. When they called our case, I felt my pulse spike. But I stood. I walked forward. And I didn't tremble. The judge, a woman in her 60s, glasses on a beaded chain, read the file in silence. Rachel opened first. Presented the binder, marked tabs, timelines, forensic summary. Her voice was low but firm. When she reached the part about the hidden trust revisions, the judge looked up. You allege he named a third party as beneficiary without disclosure. Rachel nodded. Correct, Your Honor. The party is also involved romantically with Mr. Bennett. We have written evidence and financial corroboration. Thomas's lawyer tried to interrupt. Your Honor, these are private matters. The judge raised a hand. Privacy ends when one party acts in bad faith. This court protects transparency. Thomas shifted in his seat. I watched him. Watched his hands go still, his foot stop tapping. He wasn't performing anymore. He was exposed. When asked if he disputed the evidence, he said only, I didn't intend harm. The judge replied, intent is not a defense when financial harm has been caused. She ruled swiftly. Asset freeze granted. Exclusive use of the home granted. Immediate financial disclosures due in 7 days. Discovery for offshore accounts approved. Thomas didn't look at me. Didn't say a word. Just signed the court record with a tight jaw and hollow eyes. When we walked out, the sun had started to set. Rachel exhaled beside me. You handled that with grace. I gave a small smile. Ironic, considering. She laughed softly, then handed me a small manila folder. Next step. Negotiation. But from here on out, you're not reacting. You're setting the terms. I nodded. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt clear. At home, I opened the windows. Let the evening in. Lit my favorite candle. Played the old record Chloe gave me last Christmas. Poured a glass of wine. Not to numb, but to mark the moment. The war had started, but the fog had lifted, and I could see the road ahead. 3 months after the final court hearing, the house started sounding different. Not quieter, just more honest. There was no music playing in the mornings anymore. No background hum of him clearing his throat as he read the news. But I no longer reached for the silence to fill it. I let it be. The hydrangeas by the front porch bloomed late that season. I hadn't watered them in days, and yet they came back. Purple, full, stubborn in the best way. That's how I felt, too. Not healed, but rooted. I spent the first week alone. Truly alone. No lawyer calls. No paperwork. No questions from friends trying to tiptoe around the subject. I made soup from scratch. Lit a candle that smelled like cedarwood and cloves. Reorganized the hallway closet. Donated 3 coats that no longer fit. Slept in the middle of the bed. And didn't check the other pillow. That was my closure, not one moment. But hundreds of quiet choices I made just for me. The judge had ruled in my favor. 52% of the total assets. Full ownership of the house. Retroactive reimbursement for concealed funds. But what mattered most wasn't the numbers. It was the return of my name. My voice. My edges. Rachel called it a clean win. I called it a long exhale. One Sunday, Chloe came over with muffins and a messy ponytail. She tossed her bag on the couch like she used to in high school. Sat cross-legged on the rug and asked, "Do you want to look at old photos?" We opened a shoebox from the back of the hall closet. Inside were years of memories frozen in faded light. She pulled out a Polaroid from a family trip to Cannon Beach. I had on a wide-brimmed straw hat, book in hand. Thomas was in the background, turning away. Phone at his ear. I remember that girl that stole your sandwich. She laughed. You laughed for 5 minutes. I smiled. But something in my chest ached. I wasn't happy that day, I said quietly. She looked at me. You looked happy. I was good at that. She put down the photo, leaned into me. But you seem lighter now. I nodded. I'm not quite there yet. But I'm getting closer to myself. She smiled. That's the best part. 2 weeks later, I finally did it. I launched the project I'd only ever scribbled about in journals, a nonprofit for women rebuilding after financial and emotional betrayal. Women who needed documents, not just comfort. Women who needed steps, not sympathy. Rachel signed on as the legal advisor. A retired investigator named June offered to vet asset trails. Chloe helped build the website. We called it Restored Quietly. No TV spots, no glossy campaigns, just word of mouth and trust. Our first visitor was a retired librarian. She carried her own folder, told us she hadn't slept in the master bedroom since her husband moved out, but still couldn't bring herself to change the sheets. We sat with her. Made copies, made tea, made space. That became our model. Documents, deadlines, dignity. One rainy Thursday, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside a photo. Thomas, standing outside a small real estate office in Arizona, tired, thinner, still wearing that forced smile. On the back, scrawled in rushed handwriting. You always knew too much. I read it once. Then again. I didn't feel anger. Or pity. Just distance. He was a chapter now. Not a scar. Not even a metaphor. Just closed. I slid the photo into a file marked final. Not to remember. But to never reopen. I started walking every morning. Past the house with the painted gnome. Past the couple who always watered plants in matching robes. The orange cat who followed me 3 blocks before sitting under the mailbox like a little mayor. I'd nod to the mailman. Pick up the local paper. Carry mints in my pocket, just because I liked how they warmed in my hand. I stopped rushing. Stopped asking, what if? Stopped carrying the weight of who I used to be. Now, I moved slower, but with direction. I rearranged the bookshelves, moved the photo albums to a higher shelf, put the wedding ring in a safety box, not out of sentiment, but because it no longer belonged in daily view. Some nights, I'd write unsent letters. To the woman I was at 25. To the version of me who thought endurance was proof of love. To the one who first noticed something was wrong and stayed quiet anyway. I'd write, you were never weak. Just afraid of your own power. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror and tried on a red blouse I hadn't worn in years. He once said it was too loud. I wore it to brunch. The waiter complimented it. I smiled and said, I almost forgot I liked red. That's what healing looked like. Not an Instagram quote. Not a dramatic haircut. Just returning to yourself, bit by bit. Until the silence no longer hurt. It held you. Until your name sounded like home again. Until you remembered you were never meant to disappear for someone else's comfort. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from spreadsheets, silence, and unspoken grief, you know this truth: your story is not over. And neither is mine. Because closure doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it sits across from you in a quiet room and says, you made it. You did. If this story touched something in you, share it below. You are not alone, and your voice may be the one another woman is waiting to hear. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of justice, healing, and quiet empowerment after 40.